The sun was setting on the horizon of Chicago, painting the sky with orange hues that contrasted with the mirrored facades of the skyscrapers. Michael Anderson watched the city through the windows of his penthouse office in one of the most imposing buildings on Michigan Avenue. At 45, he had built a tech empire that made him one of the most influential men in the country, but loneliness was his only constant companion. His phone rang for the 10th time that afternoon. It was his assistant, Rachel, reminding him of the video conference with Chinese investors. Michael sighed, adjusting the navy blue tie that perfectly matched his Italian suit. His reflection in the glass revealed a handsome man with striking features and graying hair at the temples, but his brown eyes carried a melancholy that not even all his success could mask. "Rachel, cancel the meeting," he said, surprising even himself with the decision. "But Mr. Anderson, it's the investors from—" She began to protest. "Reschedule for tomorrow," he interrupted, determined. For the first time in years, he felt an inexplicable urgency to leave early. As his private driver navigated the Mercedes through the congested city, Michael found himself watching the people on the sidewalks. They were simple lives, ordinary routines that he secretly envied. His gaze wandered to an old wristwatch, a gift from his mother on their last birthday together. Helen Anderson had disappeared when he was just 15, leaving only unanswered questions and a void that 3 decades of success had failed to fill. The car stopped at a traffic light in Lincoln Park, and that's when it happened. A young flower vendor approached the cars, offering his bouquets with a genuine smile that seemed out of place in that concrete city. It wasn't the smile, however, that caught Michael's attention. It was the watch on the young man's wrist. "Stop the car. Pull over," ordered Michael, his voice trembling slightly. The driver, startled by the sudden command, pulled over as soon as possible. Michael hurriedly got out, ignoring the curious glances of pedestrians, but by the time he reached the corner, the young man had disappeared into the crowd. That watch, it was impossible. Michael knew every detail of that Art Deco model from the 50s, a rare piece his mother had cherished so much. The same mother-of-pearl dial, the same aged leather strap, even the small scratch on the upper right corner that he remembered so well. Back in the car, his hands shook as he typed a message to George Miller, his head of security. "I need you to find someone for me. Urgent." He attached a photo of the intersection and described the young flower seller with every detail he could recall. That night, in his penthouse in the Gold Coast, Michael couldn't sleep. He rummaged through old boxes of photographs, something he had avoided doing for years. Among the yellowed images, he found one that made his heart tighten. His mother smiling at a Sunday lunch, the Art Deco watch clearly visible on her delicate wrist. Helen was an extraordinary woman who had raised Michael alone after her husband's passing. She worked as a literature professor at a respected university, but her true passion was poetry. Michael still kept her notebooks of verses, though he hadn't opened them in years. Her disappearance had been a mystery the police had never been able to solve. On an ordinary day in September, she simply never came home after work. Sitting in his private library, with an untouched glass of whiskey on the table, Michael felt he was on the verge of uncovering long-buried secrets. The watch on that young man's wrist couldn't be a coincidence. It was a sign, a piece of a puzzle he needed to solve. His phone buzzed with a message from George. "We've found some leads on the flower seller. You will want to see this in person tomorrow." Michael looked out the window, gazing at the city that never slept. After so much time immersed in numbers, contracts and endless meetings, something inside him had awakened. A spark of hope mixed with fear of what he might discover. But he knew there was no turning back. That chance encounter had opened a door that had remained locked for decades, and now he needed to walk through it, no matter where it led. The next morning, George Miller's office, located in a discreet commercial building in the Barini area, was filled with photographs and documents spread across the solid wood table. Michael examined every detail with absolute concentration as his head of security presented the results of the preliminary investigation. "His name is Luke Smith, 25 years old," explained George, pointing to a series of images captured by security cameras. "He sells flowers at different spots around the city, but has a fixed stall at the Wrigleyville Farmers Market on Sundays. He lives in a modest house in Logan Square with his mother, Dorothy Smith. Michael picked up one of the photos, where the watch was clearly visible on Luke's wrist. "I need to speak with him," he declared, his firm voice masking the anxiety he felt. George hesitated before responding. "Sir, perhaps we should investigate further before making a direct approach." "No," Michael interrupted. "I've waited long enough. Arrange a casual meeting at the market on Sunday. I want to meet him in person." In the days that followed, Michael delved into his memories, sifting through every recollection in search of clues he might have overlooked. On his iPad, he repeatedly examined the scanned photos of his mother's watch, comparing them to the images captured on Luke's wrist. There was no doubt it was the same model, with the same unique features. On Sunday, Michael arrived early at the Wrigleyville market. Dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a polo shirt, and a pair of sunglasses, he tried to blend in with the crowd moving between the stalls. His heart raced when he spotted Luke organizing buckets of flowers at his stall. The young man had a genuine smile as he chatted with customers, his green eyes shining with a joy that felt oddly familiar to Michael. He approached the stall pretending to be interested in the flowers. Luke greeted him with the same friendliness he showed everyone. "Good morning, can I help you? We just got some fresh roses in." Michael felt a lump in his throat. There was something about the young man and his gestures that deeply unsettled him. "Actually," he began, "I'm interested in your watch." Luke instinctively covered his wrist with his other hand, his smile faltering for a moment. "Oh, this? It's a family heirloom, not for sale." "I don't want to buy it," Michael explained, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'd like to know how it came to you." The young man took a step back, his expression shifting from friendly to defensive. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't usually discuss personal matters with strangers. If you're not here to buy flowers." At that moment, a woman in her 60s approached the stall. "Luke, dear, I brought your lunch," she said, stopping abruptly when she noticed Michael. It was Dorothy Smith, and something in her gaze as it met Michael's sent a chill down the businessman's spine. For a fraction of a second, he swore he saw fear in her eyes. "Mom, I'm almost done here," Luke replied, still keeping his distance from Michael. Dorothy stepped between them, like a lioness protecting her cub. "I'll help him arrange the flowers," she declared, her firm voice making it clear that the conversation was over. Michael stepped back, his brain processing every detail of that brief encounter. Luke's defensive reaction when the watch was mentioned, Dorothy's frightened look. There was more to this story than just a simple family inheritance. As he walked back to his car, he called George. "I want everything on Dorothy Smith," he ordered. "Every detail from the last 30 years, where she lived, where she worked, everything. And George, be discreet. I don't want to scare them." In his apartment that night, Michael mentally replayed the scene at the market. The resemblance between Luke's smile and something in his memory bothered him, but he couldn't quite place it. He picked up the old family albums again, this time focusing on the photos of his mother when she was young. That's when his heart nearly stopped. In an old photo, Helen was smiling exactly like Luke. A week after the encounter at the market, Michael was in his private office reviewing the extensive report George had prepared on Dorothy Smith. The EC. Findings were intriguing. 30 years ago, she had worked as a cleaning staff member at the same university where Helen taught literature. "This can't be a coincidence," Michael murmured to himself as he scrolled through the digitized documents on his screen. His hands trembled slightly as he held the now cold cup of coffee. Rachel, his assistant, had tried several times to remind him of the scheduled meetings, but for the first time in years, business was not his priority. The phone rang. It was George again. "Mr. Anderson, we've found something interesting. Dorothy moved to the countryside of Minas Gerais shortly after her mother's disappearance. She stayed there for almost 5 years, in a town called Appalachian Valley. When she returned to Chicago, she already had Luke, still a baby." Michael felt his heart race. The dates matched perfectly. "I need to go to that town," he declared. George tried to argue about the risks of such a direct investigation, but Michael was determined. Prepare everything for tomorrow, and George, find someone who lived there at that time. Meanwhile, at his small flower shop in Logan Square, Luke was organizing the last deliveries of the day. The young man couldn't forget the strange encounter with that man at the market. There was something unsettling about his gaze, a familiarity that bothered him. "Mom," he called, watching. "Dorothy, as she arranged some pots on the shelves. Why did you never tell me more about that watch?" Dorothy froze for a moment, her hands gripping the pot she was holding tightly. "I've told you, son, it was from my family. What does it matter now?" Her voice trembled slightly, something Luke had never noticed before. "It's just that man." "From the market," Luke began, but was interrupted by the sound of breaking porcelain. The vase had slipped from Dorothy's hands, scattering shards and soil across the floor. "I don't want to talk about this anymore," she exclaimed with unusual firmness, her hands now visibly trembling. The next morning, Michael landed his private jet at the small airport nearest to Appalachian Valley. The town, nestled among lush green mountains, seemed frozen in time. George had located Mrs. Mildred, a long-time resident who had worked as a midwife during the time Dorothy lived there. Mrs. Mildred's house was simple, with a well-kept garden and a cozy porch. The white-haired woman greeted him with the typical hospitality of the countryside, offering coffee and homemade cookies. "You said you want to know about Dorothy Smith," she asked, adjusting her glasses. "Yes, she lived here around 1994, Michael confirmed, trying to contain his anxiety. Mildred grew thoughtful for a moment, as if organizing her memories. "Ah, yes, Dorothy. She arrived here very nervous, always looking over her shoulder. She was pregnant and alone. She said the father of the child had left, but—" The woman paused, taking a sip of coffee. "You know, young man, back then I had been a midwife for over 30 years. When Luke was born, something intrigued me. Dorothy didn't allow anyone but me into the room, not even during childbirth. And there was something strange about her pregnancy." Michael leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What was strange, Mrs. Mildred?" "Well, she arrived here already, in her final months, but how can I put it? Her behavior wasn't typical of a pregnant woman. It was as if—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "As if she were hiding something or someone." That night, in his hotel room, Michael couldn't sleep. Mrs. Mildred's words echoed in his mind, along with images of Luke's smile, so much like his mother's. He picked up his phone and opened the most recent photo he had of the young flower vendor. Next to it, he placed an old photograph of Helen. The resemblance was undeniable. In Chicago, Dorothy was also awake, sitting in her small living room. In her hands, an old shoebox contained newspaper clippings yellowed with time. The headline of one was still legible: "University professor mysteriously disappears." Her hands trembled as she tucked the box back into the depths of the closet. In the next room, Luke slept peacefully, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Back in Chicago, Michael could barely contain his restlessness. The discoveries in Appalachian Valley had opened a door to possibilities he had never imagined. In his penthouse, surrounded by documents and photographs, he mentally organized each piece of the puzzle that was beginning to take shape. Rachel entered his office with a worried expression. "Mr. Anderson, the board is questioning your absences from the last few meetings." Michael simply waved his hand, dismissing the concern. His eyes were fixed on a new discovery. George had found old records of Dorothy's address before she moved to Appalachian Valley. "She lived just 3 blocks from the university where my mother taught," Michael murmured, marking the address on a digital map. "And even more interesting, she resigned exactly 2 days after Helen's disappearance." Meanwhile, at the flower shop, Luke noticed subtle changes in his mother's behavior. Dorothy was more restless, constantly checking the windows and insisting that he not go out alone. "Mum, what's going on?" he asked during lunch, noticing that she had barely touched her food. "Nothing, son," she replied quickly, but her hands trembled as she poured more water. "I'm just worried about the competition from the big flower shops, that's all." Luke didn't believe her, but decided not to press further. Ever since the encounter with that stranger at the market, his mother seemed to be carrying an invisible weight. The following afternoon, Michael received an unexpected call. It was an old colleague of his mother's from the university, Professor Beatrice, whom George had managed to locate. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "When I heard you were investigating Helen's disappearance, I felt I needed to share something." They met at a discreet cafe in Lincoln Park. Beatrice, now a grey-haired woman, seemed nervous. "Your mother and I were very close," she began, rummaging through her purse. "The day before her disappearance, Helen was different. She confided in me that she had discovered something important, something that would change many lives." Michael leaned forward, each word from Beatrice fueling his anxiety. "She left this with me," continued the teacher, handing him a yellowed envelope. "She asked me to keep it, but I never had the courage to open it. After she vanished, I thought about giving it to the police, but something told me to wait." With trembling hands, Michael opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a positive pregnancy test, dated 2 weeks before Helen's disappearance. His heart stopped for a moment as he read the first lines of the letter. "My dear Michael, if anything happens to me, there is something you need to know." His mother's words revealed a secret she had been carrying. She was pregnant from a relationship she had kept hidden with a visiting professor at the university. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she wrote. "But this baby is your brother or sister, and I fear that some people won't be happy about this news." At the flower shop that same afternoon, Dorothy received an unexpected visitor. An elderly customer, upon seeing the watch on Luke's wrist, turned pale. "What a beautiful watch," she commented, her voice trembling. "You know, I saw one just like that many years ago. It belonged to Professor Helen Anderson." Luke, who was helping another customer, didn't hear the comment, but Dorothy did. Her face lost its color, and she quickly made an excuse to close the shop early. That night, alone in her room, she opened a drawer that had been locked for years. Among old papers and yellowed photographs, there was a newspaper clipping with a picture of Helen Anderson smiling, wearing the same watch that was now on Luke's wrist. Michael, in his apartment, reread his mother's letter for the 10th time. The dates, the coincidences, Lucas's smile. Everything was starting to make sense in a way that frightened him. He picked up his phone and called George. "I need you to arrange a DNA test, but without Lucas knowing. Can you manage that?" The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange. In different parts of the city, 3 people were gazing at the same horizon, each carrying a piece of a truth that, when revealed, would change their lives forever. Michael, with his mother's letter, Lucas unconsciously touching the watch on his wrist, and Dorothy holding an old photograph, all connected by a secret that couldn't stay buried much longer. The DNA test results arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. Michael stared at the sealed envelope in his hands, seated in his office on the top floor of the building. The city below seemed tiny, just as he felt in the face of the magnitude of what he was about to discover. 99.9% probability of a first-degree relationship, he read, his hands trembling. Lucas wasn't just the boy with his mother's watch. He was his brother. The revelation hit him like a tsunami, bringing with it an avalanche of conflicting emotions. Joy at the discovery of a brother, anger for all the lost years, and a deep sadness when he thought of his mother. At that very moment, in the flower shop, Lucas was organizing preparations for a big wedding event when he noticed something strange. An elderly customer, the same one who had commented on the watch days earlier, returned to the store. This time, she brought with her an old photo album. "Young man," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I need to show you something." It was Margaret, a retired university professor. She opened the album to a specific page, revealing a photo of a literature department gathering. This one, she pointed to an elegant woman in the center of the image, was Helen Anderson, a very dear colleague. Lucas felt his heart skip a beat as he saw the watch on the wrist of the woman in the photograph, identical to his own. Her eyes scanned the image, noting the delicate features of Helen's face, her smile, a disturbingly familiar smile. Dorothy, who was watching the scene from the back door of the store, dropped a toolbox, the metallic clatter echoing through the space. "Mom, I think it's time we close up," she said, her voice betraying her nervousness. But Margaret didn't move. "Dorothy," said the former teacher, turning to face her. "You worked at the university back then, didn't you? On the cleaning staff. You must remember Helen." The silence that followed was deafening. Luke looked from one woman to the other, feeling like he was in the middle of something much bigger than he could comprehend. "Mom?" he called, his voice small, like that of a lost child. Dorothy began to cry, a silent cry laden with decades of secrets. "Let's go home, son," she whispered. "We need to talk." Meanwhile, Michael had made a decision. He could no longer handle this investigation alone. He called Rachel. "Cancel all my appointments for the next few days." Then he contacted Dr. Arthur Mitchell, a respected psychologist specializing in family trauma. "I need your help," Michael explained to the psychologist in his office. "When I confront Dorothy and Luke with the truth, I want to do it in my least traumatic way possible." Dr. Arthur listened intently as Michael shared all the discoveries of the past few weeks. In the small house in Logan Square, Luke sat at the kitchen table, the photo album open in front of him. Dorothy prepared tea with trembling hands, spilling water on the stove. The watch on Luke's wrist felt like it weighed a ton. "Why was Mrs. Margaret so impressed with my watch?" he asked, his calm voice masking the storm inside. "And why did you never show me pictures of yourself from when you worked at the university?" Dorothy sat heavily in the chair, her hands gripping the teacup as if her life depended on it. "Son," she began, her voice breaking, "there are things about our past, about your past, that I should have told you a long time ago." At that very moment, the doorbell rang. Through the kitchen window, Dorothy saw Michael Anderson standing at her door, accompanied by an older man she didn't recognize. Her greatest fear was about to come true. Luke stood up to answer, but Dorothy grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said, tears streaming down her aged face. "Before you open that door, I need to tell you a story that began 30 years ago, with a woman named Helen Anderson and a very special watch." Time seemed to freeze in that small kitchen, while outside the rain began to fall over Chicago, washing the streets and bringing with it the weight of long-buried truths. The rain now fell harder on the roof of the small house in Logan Square, creating a melancholic symphony that served as the soundtrack to the most difficult moment in Dorothy Smith's life. Luke remained seated, his eyes fixed on his mother as she gathered the courage to begin her confession. "Back then," Dorothy began, her voice trembling, "I worked as a cleaner at the university. Every day I would see Professor Helen Anderson arriving elegant, perfumed, respected by everyone. She had everything I dreamed of having: education, status, a comfortable life." Her hands clutched a handkerchief already damp with tears. The doorbell rang again. Luke made a move to get up, but Dorothy stopped him once more. "Please, son, let me finish. I need you to understand, to try to understand." Outside, Michael and Dr. Arthur waited patiently, sheltered from the rain under the small porch. The psychologist placed a comforting hand on the businessman's shoulder, sensing his growing anxiety. "Helen was pregnant," continued Dorothy, her voice now almost a whisper. "I found out by chance when I saw her feeling sick in the university bathroom. She trusted me, told me about the baby, about her fears. It was a secret only the two of us shared." Luke felt his heart pounding harder and harder. The watch on his wrist seemed to burn his skin. "Mom, what are you trying to tell me?" "I had nothing, Luke. I worked day and night, but I could barely pay the rent. When I found out that Helen planned to move abroad with the baby, something inside me, something dark took hold of my thoughts." Dorothy covered her face with her hands, sobbing. At that moment, the front door opened. Rachel, who had a copy of the key for emergencies, had arrived through the back and let Michael and Dr. Arthur in. They stopped at the entrance to the kitchen, silent witnesses to Dorothy's confession. "I kept her captive," she continued, unaware of the newcomer's presence, "in a secluded house in Appalachian Valley. I convinced everyone that she had left, voluntarily for abroad. When you were born, Luke, when you were born, I—" Her voice faltered. "No," whispered Luke, abruptly rising from his chair. "It can't be true." His eyes met Michael's, who stood motionless at the kitchen entrance, silent tears streaming down his face. "Helen Anderson is your biological mother, Luke," Dorothy finally said. "And that man at the door is your brother." The silence that followed was deafening. Luke looked at the watch on his wrist, the piece that had inadvertently begun to unravel the entire story. All this time, all the stories about my father, about our family, was it all a lie? Dr. Arthur stepped forward, his calm and professional voice cutting through the tension. "Luke, I know this is an immense shock. I'm here to help all of you process this situation." Michael finally found his voice. "Luke, I spent 30 years searching for answers about our mother's disappearance. I never imagined I'd find a brother in the process." Dorothy stood up, unsteady. "She's alive," she revealed, to everyone's astonishment. "Helen is alive, isolated but alive. I couldn't. Her legs gave way, and she had to lean on the table. Luke glanced at the clock once more, remembering all the times Dorothy had told the story of how it was an inheritance from her grandmother. Every lie, every fabricated story over the years crumbled before his eyes. "Where is she?" Michael's voice was firm, despite the evident emotion. "At a farmhouse on the outskirts of Appalachian Valley," Dorothy replied, defeated. "I have a caretaker who looks after her. I visit regularly. She's fine, just isolated." Dr. Arthur intervened again. "We need to handle this carefully. Both Helen and all of you will need psychological support to face this situation." The rain outside was beginning to let up, but the emotional storm inside that small kitchen was just beginning. 3 lives, connected by secrets and lies, now needed to find a way through the newly revealed truth. Dr. Arthur's office had turned into a sort of headquarters in the hours following Dorothy's confession. The psychologist, accustomed to dealing with family trauma, had never faced such a complex situation. In his office, Michael paced back and forth, while Luke remained seated in silence, still processing the revelations from the previous night. "We need to plan each step carefully," explained Dr. Arthur, adjusting his glasses. "Helen has been isolated for 30 years. The psychological impact of a sudden reunion could be devastating for everyone involved." Dorothy, who was under watch in the next room, had provided all the details about Helen's location. The farmhouse was in a remote area, and a woman named Constance was responsible for her daily care. "How is she?" asked Luke, his choked voice breaking the silence for the first time in hours. My real mother. How is she?" Michael sat next to his newly discovered brother, hesitant about how to show affection. "Dorothy said she's physically well, but..." His voice faltered, unable to finish the sentence. "Dr. Arthur intervened with his professional calm. "According to Dorothy's reports, Helen has maintained her clarity, but has developed a deep fear of open spaces and contact with strangers. She spends her days writing in notebooks and reading the books Constance brings her." In the next room, Dorothy stared out the window, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Rachel, Michael's assistant, had been assigned to stay with her. "Why?" Rachel asked, breaking the tense silence. "Why do this to someone else?" Dorothy closed her eyes, tears streaming down her aged face. "Envy, obsession, at first. But then, after Luke was born, it was fear. Fear of losing the only person who ever made me feel truly loved." Meanwhile, George was organizing the logistics for the trip to Appalachian Valley. Michael insisted on leaving immediately, but Dr. Arthur was firm. "We need to prepare Helen for this reunion. I'll send a psychologist I trust, Doctor. Marcia, to make the first contact." Luke, who still hadn't taken the watch off his wrist, now looked at it with different eyes. "She must have been so scared," he murmured. "All that time alone while I grew up thinking that..." His voice broke, unable to continue. Michael placed a hesitant hand on his brother's shoulder. "It's not your fault, Luke. You were also a victim in this story." Dr. Marcia arrived at the office late in the afternoon, after being briefly briefed on the situation. "I'll introduce myself as a social worker conducting a survey in the area," she explained. "This will allow me to assess Helen's emotional state without raising suspicions." As the professionals discussed the strategy, Luke asked to speak with Dorothy. The meeting was tense, filled with conflicting emotions. "I love you," he said, his voice trembling. "Even after all this, I can't just erase an entire lifetime. But I need to understand. I need to know the whole truth." Dorothy, who had aged 10 years in a single night, held the hands of the son she had raised. "When you were born, something changed in me," she confessed. "The initial plan was just to keep the baby. But Helen, she was so strong, so determined to return to Michael. I panicked. With each passing year, it became harder to turn back." At the end of the day, Dr. Arthur gathered everyone to establish the plan of action. Dr. Marcia would leave the following morning for Appalachian Valley. After an initial assessment, she would begin preparing Helen for the reunion with her children. "And what about Dorothy?" asked Luke, his voice filled with concern and confusion. "She will remain under supervision," replied Dr. Arthur. "She also needs psychological help to understand and deal with the consequences of her actions." That night in his apartment, Michael found his mother's old poetry notebooks. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he discovered a poem he had never noticed before, dated just a few days before her disappearance. "In the depths of time I hold two hearts, one that has been beating for 15 years, another that has just begun its journey. May fate allow both to grow together, under the same sky of love." Michael closed the notebook, silent tears streaming down his face. Tomorrow would be the first step of a journey he had waited 30 years to take. A journey that would not only bring him back to his mother, but also unite him with the brother he never knew he had. The cottage on the outskirts of Appalachian Valley was surrounded by a well-kept garden, with roses of various colors that perfumed the morning air. Dr. Marcia observed the property with keen eyes as she walked through the entrance gate. Constance, a woman in her 60s, greeted her with a cautious smile. "Good morning," the psychologist greeted, maintaining her disguise as a social worker. "I'm conducting a survey on literature in the area, and I heard there's someone here who greatly enjoys reading." In Chicago, Michael and Luke waited anxiously in a video conference with Dr. Arthur. The tension was palpable, even through the computer screens. Luke hadn't slept, spending the night rereading old articles about Helen's disappearance. At the farmhouse, Constance guided Dr. Marcia to a side porch where a woman with graying hair sat in a rocking chair, writing in a notebook. Helen Anderson, at 65, maintained a serene elegance, despite the marks that time and isolation had left on her face. "Mrs. Helen," Constance called softly, "we have a visitor who would like to talk about books with you." Helen looked up from her notebook, and Dr. Marcia felt a pang in her heart upon seeing the deep melancholy in her gaze. Yet there was a spark of vitality there, a flame that 3 decades of isolation had failed to extinguish. "Literature?" Helen asked, her voice hoarse from disuse. "It's been so long since I've talked about that with anyone." The conversation flowed naturally, with Dr. Marcia demonstrating knowledge of Helen's favorite authors. Gradually, the former teacher began to open up, speaking about her own works and the poems she wrote daily. "I write to my children," revealed Helen, surprising the psychologist with her frankness. "Michael must be a grown man now. And the baby?" Her voice faltered, her tear-filled eyes fixed on the horizon. In Chicago, Dr. Arthur listened to the account in real time through a discreet communication device. Michael gripped the arm of the chair so tightly that his fingers turned white, while Luke wept silently. "Did you hold on to hope all this time?" asked Dr. Marcia gently. Helen smiled, a sad but determined smile. "Hope is what kept me sane. Every day I write a page for each of them. Michael was always fascinated by numbers, so I include little math problems in his letters. For the youngest," she hesitated. "For him, I write about flowers. I don't know why, but I always imagined he would like flowers." Luke covered his mouth with his hands, sobbing. It was as if Helen, even without knowing him, had sensed something about his essence. Dr. Marcia noticed several books neatly arranged on a nearby shelf. "You have a beautiful collection," he remarked. "Dorothy brings a new book every time she visits," Helen replied, and for the first time a bitter tone tinged her voice. "I think it's her way of trying to make up for it. But how do you make up for 30 years of loneliness?" For the next 2 hours, the psychologist skillfully guided the conversation, assessing Helen's emotional state. Despite her isolation, She maintained an impressive clarity and a sharp, analytical ability. "You know," Helen said as the visit was coming to an end, "today is the first time in a long time that I've talked to someone other than Constance and Dorothy. It's refreshing." Dr. Marcia saw her opportunity. What if there was a possibility of having more conversations like this with other people? Helen visibly tensed, but didn't reject the idea outright. Maybe it's time," she replied after a long silence. "Sometimes when I look at the night sky, I think that somewhere under the same stars my children might also be looking up." Back in Chicago, Dr. Arthur turned off the transmission. Dr. Marcia's report was cautiously optimistic. Helen was emotionally stable enough to begin the process of reconnection, though it needed to be handled with extreme care. "And now?" asked Luke, his voice hoarse from crying. "Now," replied Dr. Arthur, "we begin to prepare Helen for the greatest moment of her life, and both of you need to be equally prepared." Michael picked up his phone and opened the photo of the watch now on Luke's wrist. "Mom," he whispered, "we're almost there." At the farmhouse, Helen returned to writing in her notebook. But something had changed. For the first time in decades, she wrote about the future, not just the past, and in her words, a small seed of hope began to bloom. The dawn in Appalachian Valley brought with it a different energy. After 2 weeks of regular visits from Dr. Marcia, Helen was about to receive the news that would change her life. On the farmhouse porch, her favorite spot, she sensed that something important was about to happen. The air seemed thicker, charged with anticipation. "Mrs. Helen," began Dr. Marcia, sitting beside her on the porch, "today we need to have a very special conversation." In Chicago, Michael and Luke were preparing for the trip. The hotel room where they were staying was filled with photographs, documents, and small personal items they intended to show Helen. Luke held a photo album of his flower exhibitions, while Michael organized old family photographs. "What should I call her?" asked Luke, his voice trembling. "Mom? Helena? How do I introduce myself to someone who gave birth to me but I never got to know?" Dr. Arthur, who was assisting them with the preparations, replied gently, "There's no manual for this, Luke. Let your heart guide the moment." At the estate, Helen listened to Dr. Marcia's revelation with a mix of emotions she never imagined she could feel all at once. Her hands trembled so much that Constance had to hold her teacup for her. Are they alive? Are they okay?" she asked, tears streaming freely down her face. My Michael managed to find me." "Yes," Dr. Marcia confirmed, holding her hands. "And there's more, Helen. Luke, your youngest son, he grew up to become an incredible man. He sells flowers, you know. It's as if somehow you always knew." Helen covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Years of dreams, of written letters, of silent hopes, all culminating in this moment. "When?" was all he could manage to ask. At the Chicago airport, Michael and Luke boarded the private jet that would take them to Minas Gerais. Luke carried with him a special bouquet he had prepared personally, white roses and orchids, symbolizing a new beginning. "I found this among the old things," said Michael, handing Luke a small package. Inside was a photograph of Helen pregnant, caressing her belly with a radiant smile. On the back a note, "To my little miracle, may you grow surrounded by love and beauty." At the local police station, Dorothy was giving her formal statement, supervised by Dr. Arthur. Her confession was interspersed with sobs and moments of deep reflection. "I just want them to know that despite everything I did, the love I felt for Luke was always true." Dr. Marcia continued her conversation with Helen, preparing her for the meeting. "They will be here tomorrow," she explained gently, "but only if you feel ready." Helen rose from her chair, walking over to the bookshelf. She picked up a specific notebook, her hands still trembling. "This one is special," she said. "I started writing it on the day I found out I was pregnant with Luke. They are letters, one for each birthday I couldn't share with him." In the small town, preparations for the arrival were being finalized. Dr. Arthur had reserved rooms at the only local hotel, and a medical team was on standby for any eventuality. The press kept completely unaware of the situation, had no idea of the historic moment about to unfold in that little countryside town. On the jet, Luke glanced at the watch on his wrist, the catalyst of this entire story. "Do you think I should return it?" he asked Michael. "No," replied the older brother. "That watch has already fulfilled its mission. It brought us here." Night fell over Appalachian Valley, and in different places, 4 people remained awake, their hearts beating with anxious anticipation. Helen, in her room at the farmhouse, reread old letters never sent. Michael and Luke at the hotel tried to imagine the first words they would say, and Dorothy in her cell prayed for the first time in decades, asking for forgiveness and strength for everyone involved. The next morning, when the sun rose over the mountains of Minas Gerais, a new story would begin to be written, a story of redemption, reunion, and rebirth. Tomorrow held the moment Helen had waited 30 years for, the moment Michael had tirelessly sought, and the moment Luke never knew he was searching for. The morning sun filtered through the farmhouse curtains, creating delicate patterns on the floor of the room where Helen waited. Her hands firmly held one of her poetry notebooks, as if those pages could anchor her to the reality of this long-dreamed-of moment. Dr. Marcia stood by her side, offering silent support. Outside, the car carrying Michael and Luke had just parked. The brothers remained in the vehicle for a few moments, each gathering the strength to take the next step. Luke adjusted the bouquet of flowers in his hands, while Michael held a small box containing photographs and memories from all these years. "Are you ready?" asked Dr. Arthur, who was accompanying them. Both nodded, unable to form words at that moment. Inside the house, upon hearing the sound of footsteps on the porch, Helen stood up. Her heart was beating so loudly that she could hear it echoing in her ears. The door opened slowly, and time seemed to freeze. Michael was the first to enter. His eyes, so much like his mother's, instantly filled with tears. "Mum," he whispered. His voice choked with emotion. Helen took a step forward, her legs trembling. "Michael, my boy." She raised her hand, gently touching her son's face, as if afraid he might disappear. "You look so much like your father." It was then that Luke appeared at the door. Helen brought her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. There was her baby, the son she had carried for such a short time, now a grown man. The bouquet in his hands, the flowers she had always imagined in her letters, seemed like a confirmation of all her maternal intuitions. "Luke," she whispered, her gaze tracing every detail of her youngest son's face. I wrote to you every day." Luke stepped forward, hesitantly extending the bouquet. They're your favorites. Dr. Marcia told me you always loved white roses and orchids." Helen took the flowers with trembling hands, and the movement caused her gaze to fall on the watch on Luke's wrist. That sight triggered a wave of memories and emotions so intense that her legs weakened. Michael and Luke immediately supported her, and in that moment, the 3 of them found themselves in a long-overdue embrace. Time lost its meaning as they remained there, 3 hearts beating in sync, decades of absence dissolving into tears, of joy and pain. When they finally pulled apart, they sat close together, as if fearing to lose the physical contact they had just regained. "I have something for you," said Helen, opening her notebook. "Every word I couldn't say, every moment I missed, it's all here." Michael pulled out old family photographs from his box, and Luke began showing pictures from his flower exhibitions. The following hours were filled with stories, laughter, and tears, each filling in the gaps in the other's life. By the end of that afternoon, as the sun set over the estate, decisions began to be made. Helen agreed to return to Chicago, where she could receive proper treatment and be close to her children. The transition would be gradual, with all the necessary psychological support. As for Dorothy, Helen surprised everyone with her stance. "I can't forgive her yet," she said, "but I also don't want her to spend the rest of her life in a cell. She needs help, just as I will need time to heal these wounds." Luke, torn between his love for the woman who raised him and the newfound connection with his biological mother, found comfort in Dr. Arthur's words. "The human heart has an infinite capacity to love. You don't have to choose." In the months that followed, the family began their journey of healing. Helen moved into an apartment near Michael's, and Luke divided his time between the flower shop and visits to his mother. Gradually, she relearned how to live in a world that had changed so much during her isolation. Dorothy began a long process of therapy, confronting her inner demons and seeking to understand the roots of her actions. Although full forgiveness was a long and uncertain path, small steps were taken each day. The watch on Luke's wrist continued, its steady ticking, no longer a symbol of a dark secret but now a witness to a new era, a time of reconciliation, healing and rediscovered love. One Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after the reunion, Helen attended one of Luke's flower exhibitions for the first time. Sitting between Michael and her grandchildren, children Michael had whom she now knew, she watched proudly as her youngest son explained the language of flowers to visitors. In her notebook, now filled with new poems, she wrote, "Time, that relentless master, has taught us that love, even buried for decades, can bloom once more, like Luke's roses, like Michael's smile, like the hope that never died." The sun set over Chicago, and for the first time in 30 years, everyone was exactly where they were meant to be.